Welcome to part 3. Now we've been representing tenths using base 10 blocks, and we've been representing those tenths in fraction form. So now let's explore what that looks like writing it as a decimal. So if each of those is worth 1, how might I write that on a place value chart? Well, I would have 2 ones. And you'll notice in my place value chart that I've got the word whole with an arrow above all of that. That's because we represent all of the whole numbers using ones, tens, hundreds, thousands, and so on. We always name the place value in its relation to 1. So if I say 10, I'm actually talking about 10 ones. If I say 100, I'm actually talking about 100 ones. So this one we said was worth 1/10. How might knowing what we know about this block, the 1/10, help us decide what we call this space here? Take a moment to think about that. This spot is 1/10 of 1, so we call it tenths. And you'll notice the arrow at the top says part. So everything on that side that's colored in white is about parts of the whole. It's not quite a whole one, it's just parts. So what's the difference between tens and tenths? Take a moment to think about that. Well, a 10 means that I have 10 ones. A tenth means I don't even have a full one yet. Let's fill in the chart. How would I represent this in my chart? Where would it go? Well, I know that that is named as 1/10. So I don't have a whole one yet, but I do have one of the tenths blocks. But can I just write 0, 1? Well, here's the thing. Whenever we write a number like 5 or 236, the number on the right-hand side is understood to be valued at 1. So how do we show the difference between what's a whole number and what's just part of the number? The decimal is just a visual tool used to separate the whole from the parts. So whenever we see a number and we see the decimal there, then we know that whatever number's here and all the way to the left of that are wholes. And whatever we see on the right of the decimal is parts. And if there is no decimal there, then we know it's all wholes. We can represent this as 0.1. And we can also say 1/10 or 0 wholes and 1/10. Let's take a look at this one. How many wholes do I have? I have 1 whole. And what about the rest of that? How many tenths do I have? Well, I have 2 tenths, so I can represent that as 2 tenths. So I have 1 whole and I have 2 tenths. And if I take that out of the place value chart, I can write that as 1 and 2 tenths. Some people say that as 1.2, but the proper way to say that is 1 and 2 tenths. Build 3 1/10ths again, please. There we go. Now, how would I represent this just using numbers? I don't have any wholes, and I have 3 tenths. So 3 tenths would be written as 0.3. What about 5 tenths? Well, there's 5 tenths. How would I represent that just using numbers? I don't have any wholes, but I have 5 tenths, so 0.5. Now, here's an interesting one for you. It's a little bit of a puzzler. Puzzler is a bit more challenging, and a puzzler is going to make you think. Give yourself just a couple minutes to play with it and see what you can figure out, and I'll see you back here so we can explore the answer. There's your 12 tenths. So how do we fill this in? You learned about place value of whole numbers. You were told that you cannot have more than a single digit in each of those place value locations. So can we put 12 in the 10th spot? No, we can't do that. That's not the convention. Otherwise, it might get really confusing. So what do we do? Well, can I figure out how many whole ones I have in here? 10 tenths equals 1. So I can use that to say that there is 1 in the 1 spot. And now I can see that I have 2 tenths left over. And we represent that as 1.2. But if you see this number, how many tenths are there actually in 1 and 2 tenths? There's 12 tenths in there. That's an important thing to remember. So we're going to take some time to practice writing some decimals as both fractions and decimals. The first one I'd like you to try is 13 tenths. Show me as many different ways as you can represent 13 tenths as a fraction and as a decimal. Did you show it in any of these representations? 13 tenths, 1 whole and 3 tenths, 1 and 3 tenths, 14 tenths, 14 tenths, 1 and 4 tenths, 1.4 or 1 and 4 tenths, 15 tenths, 15 tenths, 1 and 5 tenths, 1.5 or 1 and 5 tenths, 16 tenths, 16 tenths, 1 and 6 tenths, 1.6 or 1 and 6 tenths, 17 tenths, 17 tenths, 1 and 7 tenths, 1.7 or 1 and 7 tenths, 18 tenths, 18 tenths, 1 and 8 tenths, 1.8 or 1 and 8 tenths, 19 tenths, 19 tenths, 1 and 9 tenths, 1.9 or 1 and 9 tenths. Now the thing to remember for all of these, no matter which representation I'm showing these in, they all have a value of 19 tenths. So even when you see 1 whole and 9 tenths, or 1 whole here and 9 tenths, it is still 19 tenths altogether. Now this one's a little bit trickier. Take a moment to think about this one. Did you say 20 tenths? Here's an interesting representation. 1 and 10 tenths, 2 and 0 tenths, and then the last one that's added in there is 2. What's the difference between 2.0, 2 and 0 tenths, and 2? Well, they're actually the same. The one that doesn't have a decimal in there is just saying, I've got 2. The one that has the decimal in it, so 2.0, is saying, well, I have 2 and I don't have any tenths. Either way, for representing this at your level is totally fine. As long as you understand that in both of these, I have 2 whole ones and I have altogether 20 tenths. So how many tenths are there in 2.4? Take a moment to think about that. Well, if I think about it, I've got 2 whole ones, and in each whole one, there are 10 tenths. So I've got 10 tenths and 10 tenths, so that's 20 tenths. And then I've got 4 tenths. So I've got 20 tenths and I've got 4 tenths. So I have 24 tenths. Okay, here's a question for you. So I've built the number 1 3/10 like this. So I've got my 1 whole and I've got my 3/10. And I exchange this 1 for 10 tenths. I do an equal trade out. So 1 whole for 10 tenths. Is my value now the same as what I started with? 1 3/10? Is it greater than 1 3/10? Or is it less than 1 3/10? Well, it's the same. I've literally just broken up my 1 so that it is 10 tenths. So it has not changed. And if you're not sure, go ahead and build 1 3/10 like it is here, and then make the exchange of 1 whole being exchanged for 10 tenths and see. So that's it for this video. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.